Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings and welcome to our virtual Enlightenment Salon of September 4th, 2022. And today we have a great conversation in store for you on cryonics, life extension, long-termism, how these subject areas relate. I expect this will be a fascinating discussion from both a philosophical and a practical standpoint. We are joined by two of our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, and our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker. So welcome to our officers. And our special guest today is Maddie Roy. Maddie is a cryonicist, entrepreneur, writer. He has a website called lessdead.com, where he posts interesting commentary on the issues that we will be discussing today. So thank you very much, Maddie, for joining us. And by way of introduction, could you please tell our viewers more about yourself, your interest in cryonics and life extension, and some of what you consider to be your key writings?
Cool. Thank you, Gennady, and everyone for having me here. I'm really delighted to have a chance to talk with you. I've seen some of your salons before. I think it's a great thing that you're bringing to the world with those salons. I think I'll share my origin story, kind of, and then gradually share how I got involved more and more in those goals, and then we can. Sorry about that. And then we can discuss more specifically some of the philosophical writings that I've done and some practical things that I do. So I remember maybe around 6 years old, first really realizing that I would eventually die, and really not being okay with that. I remember being in bed regularly during before going to sleep, thinking about those things and being really afraid, and going up to my mother, talking to her about it, and freaking out my siblings sometimes because of that. And my mother would tell me things like, if you eat healthy, then you're gonna live maybe a few more years. And I was like, this is so far from what I'm wanting. You're way off. That's you're offering me such a irrelevant amount of what I want. And then at some point, one of core memory for me is also when she said we should go consult a therapist to help with your fear of death. And I was like, that's not, it's not and I'm pretty proud of myself for being that aware at that young age. But I was like, it's not the fear of death that I have a problem with, it's the dying part. The fear of death is fine, that's not a problem to be solved in itself. And now I have a more refined view around this core concept that I was sharing when I was young. And for the longest time, I was not exposed to transhumanist concepts, even though, but unlike most people, I feel, despite not thinking there was a way to live to radically extend life, I still remain strongly against dying. Despite only being introduced to transhumanist ideas, I think late in high school, I was kind of doing thought experiments that were maybe transhumanist adjacent, but I didn't know it was a thing. Sorry. And I discovered transhumanism. I was like, well, yeah, of course, that makes a lot of sense. um, and and then later I was interested in learning more about cognitive biases. And then one of my friends referred to me to the website Less Wrong, and I was googling about it, figure out if it was the best way I should go about learning about cognitive biases. I read the blog from uh, Rational Wiki. I didn't know at the time what Rational Wiki was. I didn't know it was like a lot of parodical or satire, and I was like, oh, well, maybe I should just read the original books from which Less Wrong is based. But then my friend told me there was a transhumanist theme kind of around Less Wrong, which I thought was really interesting. So then I read about Less Wrong, and that's the door that really like exposed me to the full meme space and the full yeah, all the ideas around it. That was my entry door to those ideas, and I discovered I was as I was reading, and then I read some of the posts by Eliezer Yudkowsky on cryonics. And unlike most people, I never heard about cryonics even in fiction. Like most people, when I talk to them about cryonics, they're like, "Oh yeah, cryogenics," like, and then they refer some fiction movie. But I had never been exposed to any like cryonics in movies before that point. I had a very vague memory as a young child, someone talking to me about Walt Disney. um, that never like revisit the memory. Um, and I was like, okay, that sounds weird, but Eliezer seems really smart. That sounds like something I should investigate. And throughout all my life, there are many things that I've done that are weird or that I feel like is not something that my family has been exposed to. And my approach has always been to keep my family updated about those things and to involve them to a large extent to avoid. And I'm really glad that I did that. It avoids having like I feel like a lot of people that hide things from their family, they become more and more different than other family models them, and their true self like becomes more and more different, and it becomes harder and harder to reveal their true self because it will be a bigger and bigger reveal as as their true self differ from how they present themselves. And I thought it would be important opportunity to try to investigate this as a group, like as a family, instead of me just reporting back what I find at like the end of my investigation. um, I was waiting to signing up so that maybe it's something that we would do as a group. And in the end, most of my that was I was introduced to Les Wrong in 2014, and then maybe a couple of years later that was the process. And ended up my sister and I signing up, and my brother being on board but not ready to pay for it right now, and the rest of my family either being a no or maybe. And we can maybe go in more details after the introduction and like how that went, this interaction with my family, and me really trying to make sure that they are making an informed decision. If they are no, that it's an informed no for chronics. Um, and then after signing up, I think I met before signing up, I met two people that were signing up for chronics, and then I went to the teens and 20s chronics gathering, and then I met like 50 chronics. It was like really interesting to go from having barely met any people signing up for chronics ever, and then like in one day meeting 50 people like this. It was really interesting event. And I wanted to go on a tour and visit chronics labs and also ethics altruism hubs and rationalist hubs across the US and Canada. And two people at that event decided to join me. So during the summer of 2018, I probably met over 100 people signing up for chronics over the summer and visited critical care research, 20 um, suspended animation, and Trans Time, and Oregon Cryo, and Chronics Institute, and Alcor, and Osiris. um, and I started getting more involved. I wrote a timeline on Chronics on a timeline wiki, which was really exhaustive. And I got some people that are long timers, like that have been there since the beginning of Cryonics, that I also reviewed the timeline that I had written. I started writing for the longest time. I had so many drafts about ideas that I had, and I didn't publish anything. And at some point, I I like pushed myself to start publishing those ideas. So I'm really interested in both the fundamental like philosophy behind what I'm doing, and also the more concrete and things that I can do right now. I've was really interested in cryonics is because my timelines for solving all the other problems were much longer. My timeline for when we would be able to solve aging, when we would be able to solve AI, were really long. Right now, my AI timelines have reduced uh, by a lot, so it changes a little bit uh, my prioritization. But from my perspective, cryonics and AI remain the most important problems to solve. Um, and then I was involved with I've been helping a lot of people sign up for cryonics for quite a while. And recently, Alcor started a program where um, a referral program where people that are signing up for cryonics with Alcor can can be compensated for helping other people sign up, and also give uh, a discount like a lot of companies do. I think maybe cryonics organization were kind of shy to use those kind of approaches to because it can be seen as like really market like sales are oriented. But it's a program where they want to include all cryonics organizations so that people are not biased in which cryonics organization they refer. And I think it's something that's been lacking. Like people, a lot of people want to sign for cryonics and they're just missing the guidance to do it. So I think that's a I really like that they're doing this program. I feel yeah. And I started like a small group in Quebec with just like a few gatherings to share those ideas. And I was already running a group around rationalism and effective altruism in Montreal, so it was easy to also create a group around cryonics. Um, and last year, I've worked for critical care research uh, over a period of about 6 months during a transition time where we were um, I've been on the board for a while, and we're transitioning to a new team. So I was the interim CEO, and critical care research has been doing research for the part of cryonics that is above 0 degrees Celsius. So that's a part of cryonics that can also be useful in more conventional medicine, where we might need the surgeons might need more time to perform their surgeries, and being able to rapidly cool down the temperature in of a body in non-destructive ways can also be useful for them. So that was really the focus of the organization. And I've also joined Stasis Foundation as a co-trustee. Stasis Foundation is based in Texas, and their goal is to help all cryonics organization with patient storage. It's been chosen for the safety of the location uh, in terms of natural disasters, the political and legal environment, and criminality. So it's really been like chosen as a strategic place. And the goal is really to not to be there compete with their existing organizations, but to support them when they need more place for to start patients. We have a, a lot of property and resources to be able to do that. So and yeah, in terms of AI, I've been involved as a project manager for a few organizations. I've worked with Art, who we're working on some of agenda related to Paul Christiano's like paradigm for AI safety. And right now I'm working with OpenAI um, and on the human feedback team, which and where we have a team of contractors that gives feedback to our language models, so the language model can learn which of its output perform better, basically. um, so yeah, I think a lot of the long-termist, like effective altruism, long-termist ideas have pretty robust, strong, well-developed philosophies behind them. I feel like more death-focused kind of ethics has less of that. There's less of a strong framework for how to make decisions from a reducing death perspective. I feel, and a lot of my writings are turn around that, trying to bring those foundational ideas. Um, yeah, I think this pretty much wrap up like my main my like my involvement so far with those goals.
All right. Thank you, Maddie. We appreciate that introduction. And in terms of our backgrounds, there's quite a bit of similarity in our childhood aversions to death, because I myself, immediately when I found out about death, was outraged at the injustice of it. And I was essentially inconsolable. The difference between me and most children is that I refuse to accept any of the common cultural arguments that attempt to reconcile people with death. And I saw through those arguments. I saw that they were excuses, that they were rationalizations, that they were designed to get people to acquiesce to a horrible phenomenon just in order to be able to move on with their day-to-day lives and day-to-day tasks and not feel that fear. I am astonished that your family, when you express those fears, actually try to take you to a therapist to that is, in my view, appalling, because that presumes that this fear of death is a problem rather than a potential motivator for good deeds. I would say fighting death is worthwhile whether or not one defeats it, because it could lead to improvements to human length and quality of life. It could lead to cures for diseases. It could lead to setting up the societal infrastructure to be less conducive to violence, to be less conducive to accidents or damage from natural disasters. And the fact that this was just treated in your case as a problem, a medical problem, that shows to me a great degree of backwardness in thinking. And yet later on, you were able to convince some of your family members to sign up for cryonics, or at least to take an interest in that. So that's very interesting. You have some persuasive abilities, and you have explained as well that you've organized various meetups in the cryonics community and in the effective altruist community, and gotten more people involved in those communities. So actually, I would be interested to learn more about what you think persuades people to change their minds about an important idea, like the desirability of radical life extension. That you could have a person starting out firmly opposed to it, and maybe even thinking that such a desire constitutes a medical problem, but perhaps after a few years, that person becomes a supporter or at least sympathetic. How do you achieve that kind of change in another individual? It seems that you're still muted, even though your microphone.
What about
Yes.
now? Okay. Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, I press a button by accident. Yeah, just to be fair, like to my mother, like I think, I think it's possible to. I could imagine like I could conceive someone having a pathological fear of death. Like if it completely like prevents them from operating in society, like I could. That seems like a case for like trying to do something about it and trying to have it more under control, so it's not completely debilitating. And it's not like it's an option that was offered to me. So I think it was coming from a good place, and I value like having been given this option. Uh, I don't see it. It's not like something that was pushed on me. It's something that was only mentioned once to me, but and probably like very casually, and no one else would remember it if they like were present during the interaction. But for me, it was significant. Um, yeah. um, I, in terms of like, I've talked with my approach about sharing about cryonics. The like framework or the mindset that I approach it with is not one of it's not exactly one of persuasion. It's like making sure people are saying no for like for a right reason. Like if they say no based on something they're misinformed about, that would and I love them. Like it would bring my art even more. Like I feel like especially for my family, people that are very close to me, if I don't make go out of my way to make sure like that they're saying no for a sensible reason, then yeah, I would feel responsible for for their death in a way. um, I would feel like I failed at least. Like, um, and I was really concerned with balancing a few things. Like on one end, I wanted to tell them everything about cryonics, but on the other end, I did not want to like saturate them and then have them like not be interested because it was too much, or and I also wanted to give myself time to learn more about how to navigate those discussions uh, before having them with my family. So I understand better what kind of like there are things that I may be grokking more and naturally, more intuitively that other people might benefit from analogies to think that they're more familiar with. So, and I think those analogies like this can be very powerful. And like this is the kind of thing that I wanted to figure out to some extent also before discussing it with my family. Um, I think one approach I like in general to talk about sensitive topics is called street epistemology, and I it's an approach that's guided a lot by just asking question, asking how confident they are about their belief and what would change their belief, and and people might say like they might give only one reason for their belief, like, and then you ask like I gave a presentation in front of a group of students, and I asked them like what people thought about radical life extension, and I think everyone was against it in the classroom, and I asked them to help me list as much reasons as possible for why they were against it, and I just wrote all those reasons on the board. There were like so many reasons. We just kept coming with reasons, and then when we couldn't come up with reasons anymore, I was like, okay, what if just hypothetically, like just as a thought experiment, what if all those reasons were addressed? You know, like we were not bored, there was no overpopulation, there was like all just hypothetically. Let's say we address all of those concerns. Then do you want it? Like then do you want radical life extension? and and most people still they were still saying no, and I'm like, okay, then there must be other reasons that are not on the board, like um and at some point you either need to say like no, I intrinsically want to die no matter what, no matter. It's not about like a side effect of living longer. It's about living longer in and of itself that I don't want. Yeah, the person, you know, either needs to bite that bullet, and I feel like it's a pretty big bullet to bite, or they need to like, okay, yeah, acknowledge that actually it is they do live in a non-ideal world. They do live in a world where they only don't want to live forever because of some other reasons. Yeah.
This is quite insightful. And actually, this is one major reason why I invited Maddie to join us for this salon, because he illustrates a very powerful persuasive technique. I am a person of fairly straightforward inclinations. So if I hear something asserted by an individual like, oh, I don't want to live forever because I'd get bored or the earth would become overpopulated, my temptation is to respond to that assertion directly and say, well, no, the overpopulation argument is false, and here is some evidence to support that. Or the boredom argument is false. Do you realize that thousands of new books are being published every day, or a lot of other new opportunities are arising? And yet, for most people, if those arguments are just rationalizations and there's something else underlying that leads them to actually be in favor of human mortality for other reasons, and they are not articulating those reasons, the technique that Maddie has outlined actually at least exposes the fact that there are these other reasons and invites people who are opposed to radical life extension to tell us really why they are opposed, or to think about why they are opposed, because they might not have explicitly even verbalized that to themselves. Maybe their underlying fear is just one of their paradigm being shattered. So if they had this psychological security of knowing that they would be mortal and they had to structure their lives in certain ways to anticipate, say, an 80-year lifespan, and all of a sudden that's called into question. Now, it is possible to have an open-ended lifespan. They're going to have to rethink a lot of their life choices, and that could be uncomfortable for many people. And I'm wondering, Maddie, do you agree that that is a major reason why many people are reluctant to accept radical life extension? And are there other reasons as well that most people don't explicitly articulate?
Yeah, I think uh, there's yeah, I feel like most people are coming from uh status quo kind of place of uh yeah, being afraid of change. There are probably a lot of people that are also like just tolerating life. They're not enjoying it, and it's hard to for them to imagine, I guess, what a better world could be like. um a lot of maybe a lot of their their issues are not things that feel like they can be fixed by just making the external world better, but it's about their mental health, which seems it's harder to imagine. All even though I do think like uh, transhumanist kind of paradigm, like advanced technology can help with that as well. It's less obvious. It can help with that, with mental health. When I kind of like chronics is like one of the main thing that I talk to about people, because I feel like there's something to be, it's actionable. Like if they change their mind about chronics, it's actionable. If they change their mind about radical life extension, it might not be actionable for most people. For most people, they might just continue living the same life. They cannot. They already have a career. They might not have the slack to like donate to charities, so it might not have a big impact on their life. Whereas chronics, I feel like there's an immediate actionable thing. So I'm mostly focused on that. I might be more familiar with reasons people don't want to sign up for chronics. I think one of when I do this kind of thing, like where I say, okay, what if this was change your mind on this, and I try to really dig to the bottom of why they don't want to sign up for chronics. It comes down to, I feel like it comes down to being afraid to being revived in a dystopia and preferring death to some probability of dystopia, which I think it's coherent. I don't think it's an incoherent worldview, and I think it seems plausible to me that like yeah, a lot of people might genuinely prefer death. Uh, I don't relate at all, but like it seems to be the case. Um, And some people preferring to like invest, maybe keep the money to like invest in other ways. Like I think one way that, and one argument I think makes a lot of sense is just wanting to keep your money to pay for either future brain preservation technology or to pay for future anti-aging technology instead of paying current chronic technology. Maybe someone thinks the probability that chronics will work right now are too low to be worth the money. It's better to keep this money, this budget for the future. That to me is a reasonable objection. Um, yeah, I guess those are the main two objections that I think I get to when I dig deeper, that I think makes sense. Mm.
Yes. And I would agree that the objection about perhaps devoting one's money to other approaches toward life extension, if, for instance, one believes there's a very high probability of reaching longevity escape velocity in one's lifetime, but the probability is contingent on the amount of financial investment, then it makes complete sense to devote a lot of money to biological age reversal research. Now, in terms of waking up or being reanimated in a dystopia, I would say I would reject that argument personally because, one, a dystopia is not guaranteed. And indeed, a dystopian society is less likely to go back and revive cryopreserved patients because the authorities in that society are not going to be as humane. They're not going to care about the well being of the cryopreserved patients to the same extent as the influential figures in a more techno positive society, a society where human rights are respected and there's a high quality of life. So the dystopia argument is not persuasive to me personally, but if somebody is already within our community and supportive of the premises underlying life extension more generally, then how they allocate their resources is very much a personal decision. And I could understand a wide spectrum of decisions being made in that regard. Now, David Wood has some interesting comments on what are some of the real underlying reasons why some people are hesitant to embrace any form of life extension. He writes, or maybe people actually do wish to be able to live much longer, but they're psychologically unable to express that desire. So perhaps one area to explore is how to get people to express the more life affirming sides of their personalities that may already be there, but latent in some way, or people are not comfortable with vocalizing those sentiments. David also writes that he suspects that many people are deeply afraid of expressing a desire to live much longer and thereby being criticized as selfish, naive, or immature. So, creating a comfortable, welcoming environment for people to express those kinds of desires may be an important key to giving them the courage to do that. Now, David Shoemaker also posited a few ideas. He wonders whether some of this reluctance to embrace longevity may be due to tribe affiliations or considerations of cost versus probability of success. And David, I wonder if you would like to elaborate upon that.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. The reason that I put both of those forward is as I get past surface arguments with people, and I say arguments in the classical context, not confrontation, these seem to be the two underlying issues. Because when we talk about overpopulation, as Gennady talked about, start taking those arguments to point, then the other arguments start surfacing. So perhaps they're in a community that is based on natural lifestyles or something of that nature. And that runs counter in their minds, not in mine, but runs counter in their minds to the idea of how you would get extended long life, and then certainly the idea of cryonics. And by the way, I am a signed up neuro patient for Alcor, so I firmly am going to say that up front so you know where I'm coming from. But anyway, their tribal affiliations, perhaps they can convince themselves, but they don't want to subject themselves to the pressure of that particular tribe that they're in, whichever that may be. And that's much harder to get over because I think, as David Wood was talking about, it's more, at that point, more of an emotional response than an intellectual response. So no amount of intellectual fact giving is really going to help them. So that's one. And then the other one is I come across people that, like all of us, at different levels perhaps, are on limited budgets, and you have to decide where to put that money. And I've talked to some that have said, no, I'm investing in my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, and I'm making sure that my business continues. And because these are things where I can clearly see that investing that money will help. And if I diverted money away from those things for cryonics, which I may be speaking to them about, the probability of success isn't the same for them. And I too think that even though that sounds like a logical argument, it really is an emotional argument as well. And getting at the emotional arguments is much harder. So I'd be interested for anybody's comments on those.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for those thoughts, David. And I think they are quite valid observations about what motivates most people in being reluctant to accept any approach toward life extension, be that supporting research in age reversal or signing up for cryonics. But I'm curious, David, if you could provide some insights as to why a lot of multi-billionaires still exhibit that reluctance. Suppose there's an 80-year-old multi-billionaire, and every year Bill Falloon, our mutual friend, gives a presentation at RadFest, which he concludes by mentioning the names of several billionaires who had died in the intervening year, and they, for whatever reason, did not do anything to extend their lives or even get cryopreserved. However, in terms of cost versus benefit considerations, those billionaires have enough money to easily afford a cryopreservation, unlike the vast majority of people. So they could still devote the vast majority of their fortunes to whatever form of philanthropy or support for their families that they might wish to undertake and have plenty left over for a cryopreservation. Also, in terms of tribal affiliations, it would seem that these people are so influential and so powerful that if they were to make a decision, a tribe in a broad sense would form around the fact that they had made that decision. They don't have as much to fear from venturing outside the boundaries of some tribe broadly defined that they identify with. So with those multi-billionaires, why don't we see more of them in our movement, either supporting age reversal research or signing up for cryonics?
Yeah, so just quickly from my point of view, I don't know. I think if I did know, I think I would make Bill Falloon very happy because he would be able to do so much more than all the great work that he's currently doing. By the way, I look forward to hearing him at RadFest. It's coming up later this year. I'll be there to see that. But I think the only thought that comes to my mind is momentum. So these people, if they're 80 years old, have developed a certain momentum in their life, and they've surrounded themselves with people that share that momentum, or at least want to draft off of that momentum, to use a racing analogy. And I think it's really hard to turn that ship that's been going and driving and being successful for so long. And I think part of running a business is accepting what you can do, pushing that envelope, and then maybe quicker than most people in other areas, letting go of the things that don't work. And I think that's part of that momentum too. But I have a lot of incomplete thoughts to answer your question. Sorry.
Well, thank you, David, for those insights. And Maddie, would you like to weigh in on what could be motivating those billionaires?
Related that, not directly on this, is I don't actually think cryonics like research is bottlenecked on money. Like, if anyone like listening is, I think it's bottleneck on both re- people willing to do research in the domain, and it requires also a lot of entrepreneurship because there's there's no large institutions supporting with a clear path of what would need to be done. There are various researchers that would be happy to help, like someone starting their own lab or something along those lines, but it still requires a lot of agency. So I think it's actually bottlenecked, and maybe we can use money to solve that problem as well. But I think it also requires like someone very agentic, a leader that's willing to uh, start a project or an organization around solving those problems. I think I think that's where the bottleneck is. So I don't know if I don't know about billionaires, but I wouldn't be that surprised if there was actually a few billionaires that would fund, like that would be happy to fund way more research like into cryonics. It's just that there's nothing to that's lacking funding. That there's no project that they feel very confident about, that they're like, oh yeah, if I put cash here, it's gonna be transformed into better cryonics. Yeah, I think that might be the main bottleneck.
Very interesting. And it is an important point. Not all bottlenecks are financial, and there is a lot of specific, highly heterogeneous work that needs to be done, both in the field of cryonics and in life extension more generally, in anti-aging research and implementing the SENS program, for example. So it is perhaps the case that a lot of billionaires may be sitting on the sidelines and they don't think life extension is such a bad idea, but what they're waiting for are some more concrete proposals which they could fund and which some sufficiently agentic and ambitious individual could present to them and say, look, if you devote X million dollars to this particular initiative, then it will work out. It will have an immense return, perhaps not financially, but in terms of length and quality of life. And sometimes, as Aubrey de Grey likes to point out, a lot of the projects in our space are very early stage and to some extent speculative. We're not going to know if they work out until many years, sometimes decades into the future. And yet somebody has to fund them. Somebody has to take that risk. Somebody has to say, well, it doesn't matter necessarily if this fails. We at least need to try this and see what happens and gain some knowledge, whether through success or through failure. Now, Jose Cordero has joined us. He is our technology advisor and foreign ambassador in Spain. Jose, what would you like to ask Maddie?
Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate Maddie for all his work. And I have followed and been in touch with him about his chronology of cryonics and his forecasts, which I find truly fascinating. And I have a couple of questions about that. For example, in lessdead.com, he has a beautiful article about how many humans will have their brain preserved, forecasts and trends. And it is very exponential, indeed so exponential, and it doesn't stop until he reaches 1 trillion humans to be cryopreserved by the end of the 23rd century. Of course, I don't think we are going to be 1 trillion humans, or maybe, yes, we don't know, but it sounds like we might be flattening out. So my question first is about, I personally believe that cryonics is plan B. And also because my co-author, David Wood, is also watching. We wrote this fantastic book, Behind the Death of Death, where we have a chapter on cryonics that we call Plan B. So we are going obviously for Plan A, which is indefinite lifespans, but we consider cryonics, which is Plan B. But going back to the dates, to the timing, I think cryonics is a must now for the people who die until the 1940s, 1950s, when at the latest, I believe, and based on the numbers by Ray Kurzweil himself, that he will present in his new book coming out next year, The Singularity is Nearer, that in the 2040s, 2050s, we will have rejuvenation technologies. Therefore, death will truly be either optional or it will be by accidents. So if we don't die, then we might not need cryonics like we do today. So number one about the forecast, 1 trillion in the 23rd century, it's too far away. But even in the 2050s, we might not need cryonics if we have been able to control the aging process and people don't have to die. So, Maddie, those are my first questions for you. So I would love to hear your feedback and congratulations on all your work.
I missed the last word you said. Congratulations on what?
On your work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for the questions, and it's nice to see you. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of silly. Like the trends, I think the trends are silly. Like when I get that far in the future, I just thought it was interesting to like have kind of an anchor point. Was mostly just a trend extrapolation when we're that far in the future. Also, at the time I wrote this article, I had longer AI timelines, so I probably meant it more than I would right now. Like right now, my views have updated even more towards short AGI timelines. So my prediction for human population and like I don't know to offer I extrapolated like 200 years from now, 200 to 150 years from now, I think there's very likely there will be zero humans. Like I think there's very likely there will be zero humans this century. I think it's also likely that we get population control, population like size under control, and it stabilizes. Maybe it completely stops growing. Maybe we decide that ethically we don't want to create more beings, or maybe we create beings at a rate that's reasonable and doesn't create overly big competition for resources with other beings other minds that are already in the world. So I think it's likely that we will actually be is either zero humans, either something that's more close to where we are and we decided to stop creating new minds, or we will be easily trillions. There will be easily trillions of minds. That would be kind of my prediction actually for like 200 years from now, or even probably less than 100 years from now. Yeah, I agree. Like cryonics will probably be a completely like it will all make sense as a concept, and we might all be digital minds by that point. There's cryonics just won't be the same thing at all. And the other thing you mentioned that I wanted to comment on is about cryonics being Plan B. I feel like sometimes I actually wonder if it's like I don't fully mean it, but with just living life, our identity. I feel like my identity deteriorates. I keep forgetting memories. If I was able to actually fix my brain, I mean, it would be a problem if everyone did that. But if I was actually able to preserve my brain, which I wouldn't be confident enough with the current technologies. But if I was able to reliably preserve my brain right now, then I would actually fully preserve my identity. Whereas keeping living life, I keep forgetting things. My identity keep probably changed to some non-negligible degree. Like I'm experiencing fractional death. I call them micro death. Like instead of like micro mort is the concept of 1 in a million chance of dying, but I created the concept of micro death, 1 in a millionth of your identity being destroyed. And I think we're constantly experiencing many micro death. And I would see like Plan A as something bigger, like allowing AI that's able to really understand what we mean when we say that we want to preserve our lives. Like what does that mean truly? Like what is it that makes us yeah, and how to preserve it. Then I think that's Plan A. Anti-aging for me, that's a temporary solution that might be good enough if it takes us a little bit longer to figure out AI. I don't think it's a viable solution long term because our identity will still degrade to a large degree. And maybe I should segue through like my other big project that I forgot to mention in my introduction, which is life logging. I record myself 24/7. I record everything in my life because I think it might be useful to recreate, either to fully recreate a mind from scratch that's similar to mine. And I see living as a spectrum, like as not a binary goal, but I want to be as alive as I can. And if that means 80% of me is preserved, that's better than 50% or 0%. And I think even if my biological brain is preserved, I still think having this extra information adds option value that maybe would be useful to reintegrate in my brain or reconstruct my brain in some way in the future.
Very
Okay.
interesting.
Let me continue because I mentioned also about the year 2040s, the year 2050s. So I would like your feedback on those points. And by the way, welcome to Madrid. I am organizing the first cryonics conference here in Madrid, just cryonics, that we call Cryonics First Response. It will be in November 12, 13 in beautiful Madrid. And 2 days before, we will have some UNESCO World Heritage visits around Madrid. So that is November 10, 11 for the tours, UNESCO tours, and the Cryonics First Response, November 12, 13 in Madrid. But going back to dates, I mentioned that cryonics might not be needed in the 2040s, 2050s. Again, these are also the ideas of Ray Kurzweil that he talks in his new book, The Singularity is Nearer, that will come out next year. And basically, he has two major dates when two things will happen. The 2029, 2030 time frame, we will pass the Alan Turing test, and we will reach longevity escape velocity, or the Methuselarity. So I repeat, by 2029, 2030, Alan Turing test and longevity escape velocity or Methuselarity. And then by 2045, we will reach immortality through rejuvenation technologies. That is why we will not need cryonics, except for maybe some accidents at that point. But so we will have immortality through rejuvenation, and also we will reach the technological singularity, meaning a super intelligence higher than all human intelligence combined by 2045. So those are his forecasts. And so my question to you is, what do you think of those dates, 2029, 2030, and 2045? And welcome to Madrid.
Thank you. I used to have long timelines, like maybe my median probability for when we would have AGI was probably further than 2100, a little bit further than that. And I thought it was relying on, I thought AGI would rely a lot on breakthroughs about what intelligence was. Now I think the scaling hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that we can just use the same technology that we're already using to create language models and have the neural networks that create images, we can just basically just tweak those a little bit and increase the amount of data that their input and increase their computation powers that they have. And we can reach near human level intelligence just through having those neural networks imitate humans. And then once we're there, we can add some reinforcement learning so that they gain their agency and their own utility functions. And then I think it's likely AI can start progressing way faster because AI can take over AI research at that point. So, and those things are much, it seems much more feasible to predict like amount of data and amount of computes and how much energy is becoming cheaper, how much computer chips are becoming cheaper. So I think those projections that I've seen in the future seems to target something around 2040. So I still would not say a precise date like this. I wouldn't, like when I say 2040, I'm just saying like maybe vaguely, some probably mass vaguely around this date. but I have a long tail of like maybe most of my probability mass is around that year, but then I have a long tail of like, yeah, it could also be way further in the future. Like I still have a lot of uncertainty about that. Um, I guess I'm think having approach and strategies that are not reliant on a specific date being true, but having various people prepared for various possible timelines. Um, and you were talking about Turing test. Uh, there's a related concept that I think would be interesting to share that I've written about but I haven't published yet, which is identity Turing test, which is the same idea of a Turing test, but instead for a specific person. How can we create someone that's indistinguishable from me, from a third-party perspective, or maybe even from a copy of myself? So if we imagine that I die, like maybe everything Gennady knows about me are things that have been captured on the web because we've only interacted online, as far as I remember. So everything you know are things that have been recorded. So an AI could, in principle, be able to recreate someone that you would never be able to distinguish from the original, my original self, even if it would actually be like different. Like maybe you never asked me what my favorite color was, so like you wouldn't know if it was a lie. But yeah, from a third party perspective, it would always be preserved. And I think that's like almost definitely doable. Then there's the question of like, does that mean that I'm still me? Like that's a harder question that I don't know, but it feels like, given that we're likely going to be able to pass the identity Turing test, then it seems like um, likely enough that it would preserve a significant part of me. That's what motivates me to do life logging. Um, yeah, I think it would require me to be way too confident that doesn't consist survival for me to stop doing life logging.
Yes, thank you, Maddie, for those responses. And I think the discussion has ventured into several fascinating subject areas that I would definitely like to explore, including the future of AI, the preservation of one's own identity, and life logging in particular. Before we do that, I wanted to highlight several comments that were made by our viewers. David Wood writes that huge areas of the earth are currently dedicated to crops to feed to animals to be slaughtered for meat to feed to humans. Switching to lab-grown meat will allow land reuse and much larger populations. So that is an observation in favor of a future where there will be many more humans than exist today. And generally speaking, I personally am in favor of a future where there will be many more humans than exist today, including humans living on many other planets and other galaxies, essentially a continual expansion of the human species to other worlds so that we diversify our habitats. We don't put all of our metaphorical eggs into one basket, which is planet Earth. So, in my view, whichever future allows that to happen to a greater extent is one that we should welcome to a greater extent. And AGIs, of course, should be designed to help facilitate that future rather than hinder it. Now, on the subject of billionaires and their outlooks toward radical life extension, our friend John H. in the chat wondered, well, with regard to the views of these billionaires, has anyone tried asking them? And there are some materials that at least give us some clues. As David Wood points out, there's a famous Reddit AMA, which stands for Ask Me Anything, where Bill Gates says, quote, "It seems pretty egocentric while we still have malaria and tuberculosis for rich people to fund things so that they can live longer." But then he added, "It would be nice to live longer, though, I admit." And this was stated in January 2015. So it's interesting that Bill Gates doesn't have a principled opposition to people living longer. It is just that he thinks combating the diseases that cause what, in his view, is premature death is a priority. Of course, the response to that would be, why not do both? It's not really possible, in my view, to strictly set forth a sequence of advances or changes that one wishes to see in the world. That's not how humans operate. That is not how progress works. Progress works through innovation on many fronts simultaneously. So this is where I would differ with Bill Gates. And there was also a quotation from Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google, who wrote, "Yes, I was singled out for death. No, I'm not actually planning to die." Of course, Sergey Brin actually has done something to help this field via the founding of Calico. Now, Calico is fairly secretive, so we don't quite know exactly what Calico is doing. Calico has published very few research studies, and some luminaries in our field like Aubrey de Grey have been frustrated by Calico's approach and the very limited results that Calico has had to show for it during these past 9 years. But still, it seems Sergey Brin's motivations are in the right place. Now, on the subject of AI, I am wondering, Maddie, in terms of when AGI comes about, and I do think 2040 is a fairly plausible year for that. A lot of the AI experts I have spoken with have essentially agreed with Ray Kurzweil's time frame of 2045, but of course, it's not possible to pinpoint one particular year and say this will be it. So from a probabilistic perspective, 2040 is a reasonable estimate for like the mode of the distribution. So I'm curious, when that happens, in your view, is there a high likelihood that this will be friendly AGI that could assist humans in reaching longevity, escape velocity, and instead of trying to supplant humans, this AGI will decide, well, it's good to promote the interests of all sentient life forms, so I will help humans with developing treatments to achieve their indefinite biological longevity while figuring out a way to peacefully coexist with them. Do you think that's a feasible outcome?
So there are many things you said that I would like to address, if that's fine, before addressing the last point. I think population growth is well, right now I think in the short term I think increased population growth would be desirable, but over the long term I think population size is actually a big concern, and I agree with people that say like over the long term it's a big concern. I think we could multiply if there's resource redistribution, and then the agents that replicate the most would be the ones that would acquire the most resources, because we would keep redistributing resources towards those that replicate the most, and at some point we would all be living in at subsistence level and consuming all the energy in the universe like very rapidly while we replicate and burn like all the energy that we have, and yeah, not have a long lifespan. So yeah, I think population size is a problem. I think immortality is basically almost irrelevant towards that problem. It's all about the number of minds that are being created, or amount of kids per parent. It's almost all the population growth comes from there. We could imagine a world where everyone is immortal, like no one ever dies, and people start having less than one child per parent. Let's say they had every two parents had one child, then the population would stabilize at a 2x factor of your starting population. You start with 10 billion, then 10 billion makes 5 billion children, the 5 billion make 2.5, the 2.5 make 1.225, and if you add this like infinite series, you're gonna get to 20 billion, and everyone is immortal. Everyone has had children except maybe like 2 people or something. That there's already plenty of people that don't want children, so it's not really a problem. And so yeah, everyone can have children, everyone can be immortal, and we can have a pretty low population in a global sense, like 20 billion. compared to the size of the universe, that's nothing. Um, Whereas you could also have life expectancy of 20 years, extremely low life expectancy, like, but then have a population growth of 2.1. And I don't remember what was the exact number, but it's like it was very low. It's like maybe in a couple hundred years we run out of atoms to create human bodies. Like even if you use like all atoms in the universe just to like form human bodies, you will run out of atoms. Even if everyone dies, just with like a small, what seems like a very small population growth, like only like a few percent population growth per year, or something along those lines. So yeah, when it comes to population growth, it's about the amount of uh, minds that we're creating that is the major concern, in my opinion. The another thing you mentioned is your desire to create more life. I think that can there's like a lot of people under the umbrella of wanting to reduce death actually might disagree on something pretty fundamental. We could imagine approach that's more targeted toward reducing the amount of death. And then if your goal is to reduce the amount of death, then you might also want to reduce the amount of birth, because every birth is likely to come with a death. And if your only goal is to prevent death, then it seems plausible for other some like ethical framework that you would also want to prevent birth. Or it could be that you want to maximize life. Like it's not about minimizing death, it's about maximizing life. And then maybe you just want to create a bunch of new life, and even though they will eventually die. um, the way I came about like being focused on minimizing death was from um, a more framework called preference utilitarianism. So negative preference utilitarians are focused on reducing the amount of preference violation or preference frustration in the world. So whatever people's preference are, preference utilitarianism, they don't just care about. It's often opposed as to hedonistic utilitarians, which are focused on either maximizing happiness or reducing suffering. Preference utilitarianism is also interested in other goals than just happiness. And negative preference utilitarians is the philosophy of wanting to minimize preference frustration. And something I've noticed is that a lot of people care about others' preference to the extent that they're like their preference. So someone care a lot about reducing their own suffering. It will often also care a lot about reducing other people's suffering more than they care about random other preferences people might have. And I think it's the same for me for reducing death. I care more about someone that will have a preference to prevent their own death than someone that has, like at the far end of the spectrum, we could imagine like a mind that has a preference that's very alien to us, that we don't relate at all. Like they want to make the world more blue, and we're like, well, I don't really care if your preference is violated, like compared to like human dying, even though both are a strong preference. Like so. The name I give to this framework is weighted preference utilitarianism. It's you weight how much you care about the preference of other beings to the extent that they're like yours, that you can relate to them. I'm still pretty confused about issues of population ethics, but right now I'm tentatively like leaning towards more minimizing death than maximizing life. And I also strongly lean toward wanting to literally live forever. Like the any probability of achieving this triumph any other goals for me when it just by doing the simple math of multiplying the probability by the size of the number. Like I don't know if I put value into a finite life for myself. Okay, third point that you mentioned is kind of Bill Gates saying that people are still dying of malaria and it's premature to work on anti-aging technologies. I think my main interest in cryonics is and anti-aging, is like is from preserving like myself and people that I love, and I think it also has a great potential for altruistic impact. I think AI alignment probably has more potential in terms of altruistic impact. I'm still interested in trying to analyze it. What are the consequences of anti-aging research and chronics? Like, what would be the impact on the economy? Like, it's hard to predict. There are many factors, but yeah, healthcare is a pretty large expense of our economy. If we're able to unburden ourselves that expense, then that's resources that can be used to solve many other problems, like other source of death, like malaria. Uh, and I feel like if if maybe it would give people like more slack, and also care more about the long-term future if they would be present, if they would anticipate being present in the far distant future, that it might change people and the economy orients to making decisions. Yeah, so just generally, I think it's a useful line of thinking to explore. And then your question, which was about how likely I think we are to get a friendly AGI. I think it seems like a really hard problem. It seems a lot of people agree with that. Also, like, I'm not doing technical AI alignment, so but from my perspective, it seems like a really hard problem. And a lot of people in alignment are like, yeah, we probably didn't even find the right paradigm to like approach the problem yet. And on top of it being a very hard problem, it's also a problem that we only have one chance. Like, we cannot just say like, oh, this AGI didn't work. Well, no, it if we create an AI that's smart enough to overpower us, like, we can only create one of those AI. Once it's created, it's going to decide what's the rest of the future light column is. So yeah, on top of being an hard problem, is we only have one chance at that problem. And on top of that, the like economic incentives are not helping us take our time. They're like propice to creating races to developing AI. So that's like a third layer of the problem. So I think it seems like it makes the problem very difficult. I still think it's the only game in town in the end. Like, that's the only thing we can do is, but yeah, it seems very likely to me that AI will kill everyone.
Well, I do have a different perspective on the AI outlook, let's say, because I think a lot of the arguments that AI will kill everyone equate intelligence with power, whereas throughout history, we know that that's not the case. One of the most intelligent people in human history was Stephen Hawking, who, for the majority of his life, was confined to a wheelchair, and he could communicate through a twitch of his lip, which would then send signals to the computer that was attached to his wheelchair, and a robot voice would read out his responses. But Stephen Hawking relied on an immense infrastructure to maintain his existence. And likewise, one can conceive of an artificial superintelligence that has to reside on a lot of server space, but ultimately would be very dependent on the humans that maintain it. And it wouldn't even be embodied like an android necessarily. It would be residing in that server space, and it would be entirely at the mercy of the humans who maintain it. So, in my view, power, essentially the ability to do things in the world, and that includes the ability to defend oneself, the ability to project one's influence, is not the same as having good ideas. It's not the same as being the most intelligent, the most insightful, the most benevolent. There are many circumstances in which any of us, when we're faced with a caveman from the Paleolithic era who has a giant club, and who might be not just stronger, but maybe even a little bit faster than we are. And he decides to club us over the head for whatever irrational reason. He doesn't like the emanations of our voices, even though he doesn't understand what we're saying. He's too stupid to understand it. He can club us over the head, and he would have more power than we do. A tiger in the wild could have more power than we do under the right circumstances. So this, I think, is where a lot of the people who project doom to the human species from the arrival of artificial general intelligence aren't quite understanding the kinds of power and leverage that humans could have vis-a-vis AI, just by virtue of us being here first, just by virtue of us having control over the infrastructure that the AI resides in. But that's a very interesting and in-depth subject of conversation, which we have devoted prior salons to. In fact, we had a debate on AGI and existential risk between David J. Kelly and Connor Leahy. We also had David J. Kelly on as our guest, and we had Corey Kowal on as our guest as well, discussing future prospects for AI and whether or not AI is likely to be benevolent. I wanted to raise a question from our friend David Wood on the rationales for or against creating more lives. Maddie, have you read the new book by the long-termist Will MacAskill, What We Owe the Future? David Wood writes that this book has a long chapter on exactly that question that you discussed, on the value of creating additional lives as compared to perhaps other considerations like minimizing death.
Yeah, we're not going in details because it was already like addressed in previous salons. Just to make a link with the street epistemology that I was discussing at the beginning with our Project Chronic discussion. Like that's I won't do it now unless you want to, but I would. That's the same way I would approach it with you. Like it seems like you've identified the crux of the disagreement that you have with people that think AI is a risk. It seems like your crux is, would AI be able to embody itself? It seems like if you were to change your mind on the AGI capacity to embody themselves, if I understood correctly your standpoint, then it seems like it would also change your belief about the safety of creating AGI. So I think that's very valuable. I think we've done like more than 50% of the work when we're able to identify like exactly why we disagree. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And I will add, not just embody itself, but have more physical capacity to affect the external world than the totality of today's humans. Because you could have a super smart human walking around. You could conceive of, say, a human with an IQ of 500 who has a body like we do, and he's walking around. Maybe he's very charismatic, he's very persuasive, he's able to convince a lot of other people to follow his lead, so to speak. I still don't think that human is going to wipe out the rest of humanity, and I still don't think that human is going to be powerful enough to overturn humanity-wide resistance if that person ends up being malevolent, though I doubt that person would be. So there's still a power asymmetry. You could have a lot of 500 IQ people, but they could still be outnumbered by the 80 IQ people, and they might not achieve whatever it is that they wish to achieve in the world unless they somehow get most of the 80 IQ people on board. So that's a bit more of a refined version of my position. So there are 8 billion humans today. If there could be 9 billion embodied artificial superintelligences, then we might have power balance shifting in favor of the embodied artificial superintelligences. But anyway, please proceed.
Yeah. Okay. One recent article that came out, maybe that wasn't discussed like in your previous discussion, is how many AGIs will the first iteration of, like once we create the first AGI, how many will there be? And it seems like there could be like I don't remember the numbers, but I think it was hundreds of millions. Like with a lot of the cost from creating like language models that we have, like at OpenAI, for example, a large amount of the cost comes from creating it, then using it, like providing the API to people. That's extremely cheap. Once the mine has been created, we can like uh, run like a large quantity of that mine in parallel. um, okay, what was your main question after that?
Yes, so the question is from David Wood. Have you read the book by Will McCaskill, What We Owe the Future?
Yeah, I've not read the book. I guess maybe I should be more curious when new books come out. I feel like I have a good idea of the meme space already, so I don't feel inclined to look into them. But uh, maybe I should be more curious and ask people around, like, or if there's like this chapter looks interesting potentially. Like, I don't know if it rehashed things that I've already read or they're new content, but that seems like something I would be interested in looking at. Um, yeah, I've rarely seen like it approach from minimizing preference violation, especially like I see as death as like an infinite amount of infinite preference violation. Like um, there's just infinite amount of years that you won't live. That's um, and usually I've never seen it actually approached that way. It would be interesting if it was approached that way. Often it's approached in terms of whether life is worth living. Like vegans will often approach it that way. They will say, "Is the life I'm eating did they live a life worth living? Did they have more happiness than they had suffering?" And when I tell people I'm vegan, like they often like will make those assumptions, and then actually like I'm vegan for completely different reasons. I'm like, well, I just don't want to create a being that will eventually die. Like that's my concern. It's not like, okay, I don't like that. I really don't like that they suffer during the life, like, of course, but that for me that's not my main crux, like my main objection for yeah. Um,
Yes, and I completely agree with you that minimizing death is essential. I have often said that whenever a person dies, an entire irreplaceable internal universe is extinguished. I do see a much larger population as compatible with that goal for the following reason. There are, I believe, immense synergies among the most creative, the most innovative minds. So every, let's say, 1 millionth person is a super genius of a caliber far exceeding the rest of humankind in the sense of being able to inaugurate new paradigms. People like Sir Isaac Newton or Galileo or, for instance, Charles Darwin. But these super geniuses work better when they interact with one another. And if you have two super geniuses interacting with one another, that creates massive synergies, much greater than if each of those two super geniuses were acting in isolation. So if there are just 1 million people in existence, there might be one super genius and he might be struggling alone to instantiate his vision, whatever that might be. But if there are 1 billion people, then there could be 1,000 super geniuses living contemporaneously, and they could be working with one another to create a new golden age of human existence. If there are 1 trillion people, all of a sudden we have 1 million super geniuses, and the return from that is more than 1,000 times the return from 1,000 super geniuses. It could be tens of orders of magnitude more than the return from 1,000 super geniuses inhabiting the same moment in time. So based on that argument, a larger human population from a sheer probabilistic perspective could generate more of the kinds of visionary paradigm shifting individuals whose work is designed to uplift the rest of humankind, and who would be able to do that much more quickly because of those synergies. So that's my argument. If you want to minimize death, if you want to minimize suffering, you need to have a lot of really intelligent people, obviously with the resources, with the space to innovate, with the freedom to innovate. You don't want them living in squalor. You don't want them living for 20 years only, because then their genius is lost, as we have seen throughout history. Whenever a young genius dies, that is just such an immeasurable tragedy. So we want a lot of very long-lived, very prosperous, very comfortable humans inhabiting many worlds in order to bring about a future of death minimization. That's my idea on this. Now, I also wanted to highlight a few more comments from our viewers on the subject of a 500 IQ individual. John H. writes that, well, perhaps this person might not be able to affect the future of humankind unless he or she figured out how to unleash something like a strangelet, a negatively charged strange port cascade, and then it wouldn't matter how many were against him or her. So if that person were really innovative in terms of harnessing the material world to give him or herself an overwhelming advantage, then that might come to pass. However, I still think that's unlikely, just because that person would have to undertake a sequence of steps to get there, and other humans would be able to oppose them hypothetically. David Wood writes, the existential risks from advanced AI arise not just from a future AGI, but from AI systems with capabilities in between today's AI and an ultimate AGI. Consider smarter social media algorithms, etc. Social media algorithms driven by fairly simple AIs, but insufficiently reviewed by human teams, have already caused genocide in Myanmar. Smarter such algorithms pursuing profits and other objectives are more risky. I have actually said, and Jose, I wonder if you would be willing to weigh in on this, because you have said the greatest risk right now comes not from artificial intelligence, but from human stupidity. And I have said, as a corollary, we should be less afraid of the smart algorithms of the future than we should be afraid of the dumb algorithms of today. What do you think of that, Jose?
Yes, in fact, that is what I always say. I'm not afraid of artificial intelligence. I am afraid of human stupidity. And we are very, very stupid, and that is the problem. So if we can enhance our intelligence, either naturally or artificially, I welcome this very much. And that is the purpose of artificial intelligence, to help us in many ways, even with narrow applications now, but with more general applications in the future. As Maddie Roy was saying, also artificial intelligence will help us to develop the next technologies, because this is like a virtuous cycle of learning. And artificial intelligence will empower all other technologies and also human intelligence. So I'm totally in favor. And I think we should have maybe artificial intelligence or robots for presidents. They would know much more. They could be in contact with everybody, and they could make better decisions. So, and let me tell you one more thing, because I just came back from Denmark. I was in Denmark in this fantastic conference, ARDD, which is Aging Research and Drug Discovery Conference in Denmark. And I discovered that they have a party called the Synthetic Party, whose political platform was developed by an artificial intelligence. So it was artificial intelligence helping humans with policy making. I think this is fantastic. I would vote for the Synthetic Party if I were a citizen of Denmark, which is, by the way, a very advanced country with stupid people, but they rely on artificial intelligence also to be more intelligent. So yes, artificial intelligence.
All right, thank you, Jose. And on the subject of preserving identity, I wanted to ask you this question, Maddie. So you partake in life logging, and life logging attempts to preserve as many details about an individual's life as possible. So even if as you continue to live, perhaps you forget certain details or you accumulate other knowledge, other experiences that become a more key focus, as long as you do that, and it could be recalled through some future technology, do you think that essentially the entirety of one's identity could be preserved in the manner that's meaningful to you? And I would add, as a corollary to that, does one really need to track everything that could be quite incidental? So, for example, you have certain key preferences that distinguish you as an individual, or certain important experiences that you've had or knowledge that you've acquired, but for instance, in a given moment in time, if you raise your hand, and I'm raising 5 fingers right now, now I'm raising 4 fingers, now I'm raising 5 fingers again, that's arbitrary sequence. It doesn't seem to be essential to my character. I could have raised a different number of fingers and still been me and still been essentially the same individual. So do you think those kinds of details actually matter, or is what is important actually preserving that essential set of character traits, preferences, experiences that define who you are as contrasted with other people?
I often joke, like I've documented a lot of ways in which we're able to reconstruct like information that seems missing. Like I speed camera just filming a bag of chips and just by the movement of the bag of chips being able to reproduce what was being said. So it seems like a lot of the gaps would be small and can be filled. And like often joke about like I have a recording device and I talk with my partner and she's like, "Man, your lens is so dirty and like your camera is it's so far, like the audio is shitty." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm kind of joking, but I mean it to some extent. I'm like, oh, it's gonna get fixed. It doesn't matter, you know." They're just like, yeah. So I mean, to some extent, like I agree with what you're saying. I think like at least audio recording is so cheap unless you count like the social cost. For some people, they feel like so awkward doing it that they would rather, yeah, I don't know, they would rather even if they thought it could save their lives, they might prefer death to like social the social cost that it would have for them. But in terms of strictly like logistical and financial costs, audio recording is extremely cheap, and I think it captures a lot of the important information. Like there's some visual information that are available, but a lot of the information we communicate is just verbally. So yeah, and we already like now recording a bunch of internal experience that like a lot of thoughts that I have are not being recorded that are really important. And yeah, just trying to record a little bit more video might be marginally like irrelevant compared to having missed all the internal experience that I have. I still value like recording a lot of my life for other reasons, and I still think it might have some value for mind reconstructing purposes, and it's cheap enough, and that it's still definitely like a definite yes and important things for me to do.
Yes, thank
Oh,
you.
sorry. And you were mentioning about like being recalled in the future. Like one thought that I had that I like sometimes I thought that feel reconforting. I don't know if they should be reconforting. Like I'm like, oh, maybe it's just again my mind just trying to like feel good about ideas around death. But I was like, if the universe is infinite, or if we live in the mini world under the mini world interpretation of quantum mechanics, like it seems very likely that somewhere in the multiverse there's currently like a giant mind that's remembering being me, or like that's remembering my life, even if like most worlds it doesn't end up like this. Like maybe most worlds that are similar to this one end up completely destroyed. It seems if the world is infinite, it seems almost certainly that there will be one world that is quite similar to this one, where, or maybe from my perspective, indistinguishable from my perspective, that ends up in am I eventually remembering being me? Yeah, that feel like really nice thought to have. I don't think I'm like, oh yeah, therefore like there are no problems to be solved. We already solved the problem. I don't make that step, but it was an interesting thought that I had.
Yes, interesting indeed. And of course, from my perspective, I have evidence for the world that I experience, that we inhabit. I don't really have evidence for other worlds or the existence of parallel universes, or worlds where certain events have taken a different trajectory. So I'm not going to rely on that in terms of my actions. I'm going to rely on what I have concrete evidence for. Uh, but definitely an interesting thought experiment. I wanted to ask Art Ramon if he had any questions or comments.
Hey, Maddie, thanks for coming on the show. As far as long-termism, with some people who aren't convinced that living longer would be useful, I mean, do you ever sort of get on the other side of the argument and maybe try to qualify, like, what's your life purpose? What would you do with your life, if you could live another 200 years? Maybe some people just don't really have a life's purpose, and maybe you could help them find a life's purpose. Is there anything along that you've done or you've considered?
Like, I don't know if it directly addresses your question, but one thing that often comes up is people saying, and it kind of came up also with the Gennady in terms of birth, like, but people will often say like, oh yeah, death is necessary for progress. And I'm like, or Gennady was saying birth is necessary or is useful for progress. And I'm like, um, especially when it comes to death, like if I'm more strongly about death than birth, but I'm like progress towards what? Like, what is so important that you're willing to like have everyone that ever lived to die? Like, what's so important? Like, so you can have. I don't understand it. Like, more equality, more like more technology, more happiness. Like, what, you're gonna kill everyone that ever lived toward that progress? Like, for me, life extension is the most important thing to make progress on. I would not sacrifice progress on that thing for like other things. um, and I like to try to disentangle those things to really understand the crux where people are coming from. Like, I didn't get a chance to respond to this point that Dad made, but like, is birth or death something that is being disvalued in and of itself? Like, if we had someone died in the causally disconnected universe that would never affect anything in this universe, or if someone was birthed in a causally disconnected universe, like, it's like isolating the variables in our ethical framework. It's like doing a physics experiment. Okay, there's a ball that will fall. There will be no friction. It will be a perfectly round ball, and it's like, okay, yeah, that's not real life, but at least we get the basic underlying equation, and then we can see. Okay, then we can see if our disagreement is about our fundamental values or the specific context in which we find ourselves, and the different trade-off and beliefs about how the world will unfold.
Now, suppose, just a thought experiment, this existence is a simulation. So what if there are people out there who are just non-playable characters and they just don't want to live longer because they have no purpose? They're just filling space. What do you think on that?
I mean, okay. Okay, this is not a serious thought, but like a joke that I sometimes make is like, I'm like, once you like exit the, like, sometimes I mess around with like the cult idea, and I'm like, oh, a really good cult idea would be like the idea that if you exit the cult, you will start being simulated, because you're not a relevant part of history anymore. You're not like a part of history that created AGI. So yeah, I just think it's a like funny thought, but and like being serious, I guess, if if there is a bunch of simulations of minds similar to us being run in the multiverse, I guess all bets are off. Like I I don't know. I would not assign particularly high probability to this hypothesis. It just seems the one you mentioned just seems one among a sea of potential reasons people might be simulating us. So yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Yes. And there has been an interesting discussion of the simulation hypothesis in our chat as well. David Wood writes, by far the best summary of the simulation hypothesis is the recent book Reality Plus by philosopher David Chalmers. It gives a very fair assessment to the views of Nick Bostrom and others. And it's interesting too, he writes, the way David Chalmers puts it, the simulation argument in its pure form goes beyond any scientific analysis, but that doesn't imply it is meaningless. Chalmers writes convincingly, my view of the simulation hypothesis is similar to what the French mathematician Laplace wrote in response to Napoleon when Napoleon approached Laplace and essentially asked him, well, you have all of these elaborate frameworks on mathematics, on science, on the workings of the universe, but where is the room for God in that worldview? And Laplace replied, sire, I have no need for that hypothesis. And Napoleon actually accepted that response because Napoleon wasn't particularly religious himself. He just deployed religion kind of pragmatically as a tool of power, but he was too a man of the Enlightenment. So my response to the simulation argument is I have no need of that hypothesis. In terms of Occam's razor, it seems that assuming that this is the real underlying reality provides as much explanatory power as any simulation hypothesis. I don't see anything that would be different in our day-to-day existence, whether the simulation hypothesis were true or false, unless we started actually getting data like the character Neo from the Matrix was getting, that, this really isn't the underlying reality, that machines are somehow simulating this for humans and are really mining humans for some sort of resource behind the scenes. But we don't have any evidence of that actually being the case. So I was also curious, Maddie, in terms of the long-termist argument. We have about 12 minutes remaining. In a few minutes, could you discuss some of your thoughts on long-termist versus short-termist approaches to life extension? I thought that was a fascinating post that you had written.
Yeah, like the distinction, like that effective altruists make when they make those kind of decisions is one that I make also in my personal life. And we could so like an example of a short-termist intervention for life extension would be one that's focused on experiencing more, assuming the world doesn't radically change. So for example, maybe we find intervention where we sleep 1 hour less per day, and assuming we sleep like we're awake like 16 hours per day, then that would buy us like 6% life extension. So that sounds, from a short-termist perspective, it sounds like a potentially great intervention. But if you think about the world will change in the future, and we might reach a world where we will have anti-aging technology, then the priority becomes making it to that time. Making even, let's say there was like a technology where a drug you would take that would make you sleep 5 hours more per day, but it would make you live like 6 months longer. Then I'm like omitting some things from the analysis just for simplification as an illustrative example, but then um, then you're more likely to reach a time in history where we have technologies to cure aging, or at least reach longevity escape velocity. So even though you would lose 25%, let's say, of your life expectancy by sleeping so much, uh, the only game in town kind of is being able to reach a world of radical life expectancy. Like if like 1 million years or something along those lines, like really large number of years is on the table, and there's plausible path toward that amount of years, everything becomes about increasing the probability of this instead of just um, doing more certain interventions to increase our lifespan right now.
Yes, thank you for those thoughts, Maddie. And I am also inclined to support the view that living chronologically as long as one possibly can is desirable, whether one spends much of that time sleeping or awake or doing more intensive or less intensive activities. So, whatever hastens the arrival of biological death uh, is undesirable. Whatever prolongs one's biological existence right now and for the foreseeable future is desirable. I would take it to the point of essentially setting forth in no uncertain terms that even if I were to enter a prolonged coma or a vegetative state or a brain dead state, I would still want to be kept on life support for as long as possible, sparing no resources, because that would improve my probability of reaching the arrival of technologies that would radically extend my lifespan.
Yeah, and I don't know if you alluded to this in what you just said, but yeah, it's the same with cryonics. I'm like, I would much prefer to preemptively go preserve my brain, because then I would do it in better condition. It's more likely that I would preserve my brain, and then I might be betting like 10 years of my life. And again, I'm simplifying the argument, but I might be sacrificing like 10 years of my life by getting cryopreserved preemptively. But then if I increase the quality of my preservation by 10% and probabilistically, then the 10% of living potentially radically longer life, that's way more important for me than the immediate 10 years I could gain. So this kind of trade-off for me is what I mean by long-termist approach. Yeah.
Now, that's interesting because we interpret the long-termist approach a bit differently in this particular case. So I would say I want to postpone the moment of legal death to the extent possible. And that would essentially give me the opportunity to maximize my chances of reaching longevity escape velocity. But even if that meant suffering from dementia, cognitive decline of some sort, I would still select being kept alive, including on life support, for as long as possible before I would have to go into cryonic suspension. And the reason for that is not just to wait for better technologies, but in a future that allows revival from cryostasis, I would assume the technology would also be good enough to restore whatever aspects of one's personality might have been lost due to cognitive decline, especially if there is audiovisual evidence. So you do the life logging, and that would provide plenty of evidence for future reanimators to draw upon to try to reconstruct not you with a brain that might have been damaged by disease, but you with a brain that operated at its peak. Not just that, but of course the cryopreservation process itself can damage the brain and damage other tissues of the body. So at whatever time one enters cryonic suspension, that's a concern. But I would say future technology can undo both types of damage, in which case it makes sense if one chooses to go into cryonic suspension to do that as late as possible while prolonging one's current span of existence.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there are long-termist arguments for not getting cryopreserved as well. I don't think your short-termist argument for getting crowd preserve like is strictly worse on the short-termist frame. I think the crux, like one of the crux is like how much damages will you get experienced by aging more versus chronics, and how soon do you think the technologies will be for anti-aging? If you think they're way off in the future, then waiting for them is not worth it. If you think they're about to happen, then they're about to be breakthrough, then it doesn't seem worth to get preemptive chronics. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm inclined to agree with Aubrey de Grey. I think his probabilistic estimate is quite plausible that within about 15 years, we have about a 50% probability of reaching longevity escape velocity. So that's close enough for most people who are alive today. So now we have about 3.5 minutes left in our broadcast. I wanted to ask Jose if he had any final comments.
Well, again, Maddie, it is great to see you. And remember, welcome to Madrid for the Cryonics Conference Training and Theory on November 12-13, and the tours before to the UNESCO sites around Madrid. So first, my welcome. Second, congratulations again on your work. I have been in contact with you for some time, and I think you are doing great work, looking into the past and, more importantly, looking into the future. So that is exciting. I want to say greetings again, and keep on doing what you are doing. And let's move forward together towards indefinite lifespans, full of life and opportunity for everybody. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jose. And now, Art Ramon, do you have any closing comments?
Just thanks for coming on the show, Maddie. Hope to hear more on your work. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Art Ramon. And I would like to echo both Jose's and Art Ramon's comments. We have about 1.5 minutes for closing remarks. What do you want to say, Maddie, that perhaps you would like to expand upon from prior comments, or summarize the discussion in some ways? Please go ahead.
I think a lot of people think that life extension is either undesirable and unachievable, or they believe it's both desirable and inevitable. I'm at a weird intersection where I think it's both. I both desire it a lot, and also think it will be extremely hard and unlikely that we will achieve it. And I still think it's worth working hard towards that goal. And I welcome any viewers, people that I don't know, to reach out to me. I like meeting new people in those space, or anyone that wants help signing up with Cryonics, or anything else you want to share with me. You're welcome to reach out to me. And if you've liked things that I've shared today, I invite you to subscribe to my newsletters on Less Dead and Maddie Roy. .com, or right now mattieroy.github.io for more content on those things. And thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure discussing those things with you all.
Yes, thank you very much, Maddie, for joining us today. So the website is maddieroy.github.io.
With the dash, yeah, Maddie-roy.github.io.
Maddie-roy.github.io. All right, so we will post that link shortly. And I would like to extend my appreciation to our panel, Dr. Jose Cordero, Art Ramon Garcia, and David Shoemaker, who was with us earlier, and also to our wonderful audience who kept this discussion philosophically multifaceted and engaging. We delved into arguments for life extension and cryonics. How do we persuade people who might be reluctant? We discussed artificial intelligence. We discussed long-termism. We discussed the preservation of identity and life logging, and all of the interesting connections among these subject areas. This is a core purpose of our virtual Enlightenment salons, to connect various disciplines, various ideas, to generate new insights. I believe we have very much done that today. So thank you to everyone who made that possible. And until next time, Live long and prosper.